So making a game for the end of the world, I'm trying to, focus on different aspects, but I found myself flipping between quite a few different things as I'm sort of working through in my head what I'm, intending to work on. So this week I've worked on a bunch of things, so I thought we'd go through them. And the first one is the thing called a mutable plugin that Epic Games did, which allows us to set up a bunch of essentially a graph that allows you to switch clothing within the game. And I think this is an important feature because it gives you a visual information about where in the world you are, right? So outside of this place called the Tower is considered outside. So we'll talk about those particular maps in a sec, but the idea is that you need to change your clothing to go outside. It's deadly without some kind of protective suit. And so the initial sort of thinking was that you've got an interior costume and an exterior costume, but actually this system allows you to make any number of costumes available. And the Epic Marketplace has quite a lot of different things that I could purchase. I'm not going to throw myself into buying a load of clothing yet, but just the idea of having the possibility of having different clothing, I think is really, I'm not going to do a full-on character customization thing, but at least allowing to have a small wardrobe, I think is going to be useful for the game just to feel right. So the clothing system set up, it allows you to, add and remove items of clothing. And that's, I think, a visual sort of metaphor for where you are in the world, right? Whether you're at risk or not. So the hazmat suit obviously is the sort of biggest clothing aspect. Next I wanted to just quickly talk about programmer art and kit bashing and that kind of thing. A lot of the stuff that you see in these videos is just me testing things out. It's not intended to show the final look and feel of what the world is going to look like. Not least because I haven't figured out a lot of the visual aspects of it anyway. But this idea of kit bashing, right? Like using stuff that you've got already, I've got a ton of art, packs of art that I've bought in from say fab.com or somewhere like that. And the idea is that you just sort of put something in there to make it as a placeholder. And so you'll see through these levels that I'm showing today that there's a lot of pipework and stuff from a couple of different asset packs. So just be aware that none of this stuff is final, right? And a lot of the things that I'm making, things like the little Bob robot, I'm kind of learning, obviously as a solo developer, right? I can't rely on somebody else to do any of this work. So I've got to figure out a way of keeping everything manageable, and which means I have to figure out my process, right? What is the art going to do? And part of that is just trying to build it, and then failing, and then trying again with a different approach, and eventually, getting somewhere that I'm pleased enough with that I can say that that's kind of done. So the next part, we're going to talk about the sort of maps and transitions thing. Up until now, I've been working in individual levels. So in Unreal Engine, you kind of have this concept of levels or maps, the games. And the idea is that I wanted a quick way of transitioning between them so I could figure out how the flow of different interactions works. So I made this little circle thing that when you step on it, it transitions you into a different map. And when I was doing that, I realized that I needed to have some, essentially a screen that pops up to show that the thing's loading a different space. And so I've got this new sort of maps and transition system partly set up. It's not finished because I've not worked on all of the maps yet. I've been putting placeholders in place for a bunch of them. But you should be able to see that what essentially is just a stand-in for doing actual interactions that transition you from one map to another. And there's quite a lot of it in the game because that's kind of the design aspect that I was going for. Very much inspired by Mountain Blade, and that game specifically has transitions between the sort of overworld, which we'll have a look in a second, and the sort of, you know, cities and villages and stuff. So that's what I'm going for, really. I'm trying to make it so that I don't have one individual map. I'm not going for a massive open world or any of that nonsense. As an indie developer, as a solo developer, can't afford to do any of that. And plus, it helps performance if the maps are relatively kind of compartmentalized. So that's what I'm hoping to be the case, at least. So let's talk about a couple of the maps. The first one is the Hole. And the Hole itself is a map that's defined by this large concrete sort of depression in the landscape. And the Hole is meant to be this like big concrete wall that people have built to protect those things underground. So the Hole is actually the top of a whole complex of underground bunkers and stuff. And so I've made a placeholder hole, and then there's in the center of the hole, there's going to be a tower, right? So the tower is like a watchtower. Think of it as a sort of way of viewing out into the world, but actually you don't really see an awful lot. You see a concrete hole and a little bit of landscape and stuff. But the point is that the intention for the hole is to have it become populated over time. So you'll see that kind of stuff transitions as you interact with entities out in the world, let's call it that. So I made a placeholder tower and textured it, and again, that process is one of sort of learning the pipelines that I'm going to eventually use, and realizing that I hate the texturing process and the UV unwrapping process really badly. But the point is that you start the game right at the start. When you start a new game, you live in the tower. The tower is essentially the sort of tutorial on how to just generally do things. The tower is also the way that you see that there is a world outside. So, you know, it's a transition point between the overworld, the sort of outside world, and the inside world, the bunker space. So I think the tower is going to be an important thing. So eventually I'll have to put a lot of effort into that. But for now, I'm just placeholdering it with, well, you'll see, you know, it's not great. So the Hole, the map for the Hole itself is basically just a landscape with a hole in it. But it does start to show things like the atmospherics and the fact that there's a pipeline coming out of the hole. I haven't finished the pipeline sort of aesthetics yet. I'm still figuring that out. But the whole point of the pipeline is to show that you are connected with the outside world, even if you're inside the hole, you know, even if you're inside the tower and inside the bunker, there's a connection there. And so that pipeline is kind of a metaphor for how much you want to give out into the world. And so one of the aspects of the outside world is that it's toxic and you kind of need air to breathe to make it, you know, to keep sort of existing in the outside space. So it's a bit of a survival game. And one of the features that I'm currently working on is that, like, you can essentially tap into the stuff in the pipeline. So essentially the pipeline is the safest way to traverse the outside world, right? The overworld and the Hole. If you stick close to the pipeline, you won't run out of oxygen. And so that's one of the sort of main things, right? Is that you need to be able to get, you know, air into your oxygen tank. So that interaction's an important one. I'm still working on that one. I'm still working on the display for the UIs and all that kind of stuff. And finally, I guess to sort of wrap up is this concept of pipelines and the interactions in the overworld. So as you exit the Hole, you go to the overworld map, which is basically sort of a high level view of the world And you start off, obviously, from when you transition from the hull, you start off just near the hull, and follow the pipeline out. But this is where you'll encounter other, I'm calling them tribes in my head, but I don't know what to call them, populations. And actually there are a few fixed locations that I've got planned, but there's also, I wouldn't call them random, but there's also encounters that you'll have with other denizens of the overworld. So the idea is that as you travel, you'll find new spots to scavenge, you'll find new people to interact with. You can go to fixed locations that you'll sort of learn as you figure out what the map is. But also there'll be, you know, dynamic encounters, right? There'll be stuff that happens that will be sort of generated as you're going along. So a lot of it is, it's a looter loop, really. It's a sort of trade loop as well. But the overworld is, again, still kind of placeholder. All of it is placeholder, really. It's just a matter of figuring things out, right? And making sure that it all at least functions. So the overworld map, I think, is probably one of the biggest sort of factors I need to think through, because I'm currently using two different systems for that. The overworld is viewed from a top-down perspective, whereas all of the other maps are viewed from a third-person or first-person perspective. And I'm just not fundamentally sure which way to take that. So that's one of the things that I'm going to work on, I guess. But you'll see that the pipelines will still have interactions, so you'll still be able to refill your oxygen tanks. Again, it's useful to tether yourself to the pipeline in a way. It's useful to make sure that, like, if you want to mitigate risk of, like, it's the sort of risk-reward cycle in the overworld, right? Is that you'll find things that are more interesting or useful to scavenge out in the overworld map net, you know, away from the pipeline. Gives you better loot, I guess. So that's a sort of risk-reward cycle that I think is going to be useful. And obviously, if you want to play it safe, stay near the pipe, interact with people that come along, set up trade and that kind of thing with those, and let other people take the risk, right? Let the denizens of the world take the risk, and you just interact with them, even in a minimal way, will get you some value. So that's the current process for this week. And I think there's been some progress, you know, like I think that I've kind of fallen more in love with the whole concept of it. Just sort of being able to run around different maps has definitely given me, you know, a good feeling about it, I guess. So we'll see as it fleshes out and you start to see sort of final artwork and all that kind of stuff. Obviously it happens in every game, right? Even AAA games have this period where it looks like crap and you know, it doesn't quite represent what it's going to be at the end, but we're still, you know, you're still feeling your way through what it could be. And that's where I'm at right now, I think. So there you go. That's this week's update.